Sarah McAllister was only 12 years old when her world fell apart. The year was 1876, and the Wyoming Territory was a hard place for anyone to survive. But it was especially cruel to a child alone. Her parents had died during the winter. Taken by a fever that swept through the small settlement like a ghost, one day they were coughing. The next they were too weak to stand, and within a week, both of them were buried in the frozen ground behind the cabin. The other settlers had come to the funeral, their faces grim and sympathetic. But none of them offered to take Sarah in. Times were too hard. And everyone had their own struggles. Their own children to feed, their own land to work, their own battles to fight against the unforgiving wilderness. They looked at the small blonde girl with pity in their eyes. But pity didn't put food on the table or keep a fire burning through the cold nights. After the last prayer was said, they went back to their own homes and left Sarah to face her fate alone. The cabin was small and drafty, with gaps between the logs that let the wind whistle through. Her father had built it with his own hands 3 years earlier. When they first arrived from Pennsylvania full of hope and dreams of a better life, now Sarah was the only one left to keep those dreams alive. The cabin sat about a mile from the nearest neighbor and 3 miles from the small trading post that served as the center of the settlement. It was close enough to the Snake River that she could hear the water rushing over the rocks when the wind was right, but far enough that she had to walk 20 minutes each way to fetch water every morning. Sarah woke up before the sun rose. She had to, because there was so much work to do first. She would restart the fire in the small stone fireplace, using the embers she had carefully banked the night before. Then she would eat a small breakfast, usually just cornmeal mush or a piece of dried meat if she was lucky. After that came the water hauling, 2 heavy buckets balanced on a yoke across her thin shoulders, walking carefully down the rocky path to the river and back. The garden her mother had planted took up most of her day. The small patch of land behind the cabin grew potatoes, beans, and corn, but the soil was poor and the weather was unpredictable. Sarah spent hours pulling weeds, carrying more water for the thirsty plants, and trying to keep the deer and rabbits from eating everything. She had set up a scarecrow using her father's old clothes, but the animals didn't seem to care. When she wasn't working in the garden, Sarah checked the snare traps her father had taught her to set. She had 6 of them placed around the property, hidden in the brush where rabbits liked to run. Some days she caught nothing and her stomach would growl with hunger. Other days she might catch 1 or 2 rabbits, which she would skin and cook over the fire. She saved the furs, thinking maybe she could trade them at the post for flour or salt. The loneliness was the hardest part. Sarah could handle the hard work, and she was learning to deal with the constant hunger and tiredness. But the silence of the cabin at night was almost unbearable. She missed her mother's voice singing old songs while she cooked. She missed her father's stories about his own childhood back in Pennsylvania. She missed having someone to talk to, someone to share the burden with, someone to tell her that everything would be all right. Sometimes the other children from the settlement would pass by on the road, and Sarah would watch them from her garden, laughing and playing together. They never stopped to talk to her. Their parents had warned them to keep moving, that there was work to be done and no time for socializing. Or maybe they were afraid that bad luck was catching, that if they got too close to the orphan girl, tragedy might find their families too. At night, Sarah would sit by the fire and try to stay awake as long as possible. She was afraid of the darkness, afraid of the sounds of animals outside, afraid of the creaking of the cabin walls, but most of all afraid of her dreams. When she slept, she often dreamed of her parents, seeing them healthy and happy again, only to wake up and remember that they were gone forever. So she would force her eyes to stay open, staring at the flames until they burned down to coals, until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The settlement's minister, Reverend Thompson, had stopped by once in the early spring. He had asked Sarah if she was managing all right. If she needed anything, she had lied and said she was fine, pride keeping her from admitting how scared and alone she really felt. He had nodded, seemingly relieved that he didn't have to do more, and promised to check on her again soon. That was 3 months ago, and he hadn't returned. Sarah knew that she couldn't survive another winter alone. The supplies her parents had stored were running low, and she didn't have enough money to buy more. She didn't have the strength to cut enough firewood, or the skill to hunt larger game. But she didn't know what else to do. Running away meant certain death in the wilderness, and no one in the settlement wanted to take her in. So she kept working, kept surviving, kept hoping that somehow things would get better, even though she couldn't see how. August arrived with scorching heat that baked the Wyoming territory until the ground cracked like broken pottery. Sarah had never experienced such brutal temperatures. The sun felt like a hammer beating down on her head every time she stepped outside, and the small cabin became an oven during the afternoon hours. She took to doing most of her work in the early morning or late evening, resting in the shade during the worst of the midday heat. The garden was suffering despite all her efforts. The corn stalks drooped and turned brown at the edges, and the bean plants wilted no matter how much water she carried from the river. Sarah knew she was fighting a losing battle, but she refused to give up. Every plant that survived meant food for the winter, and every bit of food might mean the difference between life and death. On this particular afternoon, Sarah decided to check her fishing lines. Her father had taught her how to set them in the deeper pools along the river. Using bits of dried meat as bait, it was a long shot. But sometimes she got lucky and caught a catfish or trout. Fish meant protein, something her body desperately needed. She could already feel herself getting weaker, her dresses hanging looser on her frame with each passing week. She grabbed an old basket and started down the familiar path toward the river. The trail wound through scrub brush and scattered pine trees, rocky and uneven in places. Her shoes, which had belonged to her mother and were too big, made walking difficult. She had stuffed them with rags to make them fit better, but they still flopped with each step. Still, they were better than going barefoot over the sharp stones and thorns. As Sarah approached the river crossing, she heard something unusual, a low sound that might have been crying or moaning. She froze, listening carefully. The sound came again. Definitely human, definitely pain. Her first instinct was to run back to the cabin. Her father had always warned her about strangers, especially out here where law and order were just suggestions. But something made her creep forward instead, moving quietly through the brush toward the sound. She remembered how it felt to be hurt and alone, to need help and have no one to call on. Her conscience wouldn't let her walk away without at least looking. When she peered around a large boulder, her breath caught in her throat. About 30 feet away, near the water's edge, sat a native girl. She looked older than Sarah, maybe 14 or 15, with long black hair that hung in 2 braids over her shoulders. She wore a buckskin dress decorated with small blue beads and moccasins on her feet. But what caught Sarah's attention was the girl's leg. The left leg was clearly badly injured. Swollen to nearly twice its normal size, it bent at an odd angle below the knee. The girl had fashioned a crude crutch from a tree branch, but it wasn't enough. She was trying to stand, using the crutch and a boulder for support, but kept falling back down with gasps of pain. Tears streaked her dusty face, and she was clearly exhausted. Sarah knew she should be afraid. The tensions between the settlers and the native tribes had been growing worse all summer. Just last month, a wagon had been attacked on the northern trail, and 3 men had been killed. The settlers blamed the Shoshone. The Shoshone blamed the settlers for encroaching on their land, and the violence kept escalating. Everyone said to stay away from the natives, that they couldn't be trusted, that they were dangerous. But looking at this girl, Sarah didn't see danger. She saw someone young and hurt and scared, just like herself. The girl was clearly trying to cross the river, kept looking desperately at the far bank where the forest grew thick and green. She needed to get home, but the river was running fast and deep, swollen from snowmelt high in the mountains. Even a healthy person would struggle with that crossing. Sarah stepped out from behind the boulder. The native girl's head snapped up and their eyes met. For a long moment, neither moved. The girl's hand went to a small knife at her belt. Her body tensing like a cornered animal, Sarah could see the fear in her dark eyes, but also something else, a pleading desperation. Slowly, Sarah raised both hands to show they were empty. She had no weapons, posed no threat. She took a small step forward, then another, moving carefully like she was approaching a wild deer. The girl watched her every movement, hand still on the knife. But she didn't try to run or attack. Sarah pointed to herself and said, "Sarah." Then she pointed to the girl, making it a question. The girl hesitated, then touched her own chest and said something that sounded like, "Dakota." Her voice was hoarse. Probably from crying, Sarah pointed to Dakota's injured leg, then winced and shook her head to show sympathy. Dakota nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. Then Sarah pointed to the far side of the river, and Dakota nodded eagerly. Yes, that was where she needed to go. Sarah pointed to herself, then made a gesture of carrying something on her back, then pointed to the other side again. Understanding lit up Dakota's face. But doubt followed quickly after. She gestured at the river, at how fast and dangerous it looked, and shook her head. She didn't want Sarah to risk her life, but Sarah had already made up her decision. She couldn't leave this girl here to die, and that's what would happen if Dakota couldn't cross. The heat would kill her, or thirst, or some wild animal would find her helpless. Sarah walked to Dakota's side and knelt down. Offering her back, Dakota said something in her own language, words Sarah couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear. "Are you sure?" She turned and looked into Dakota's eyes, and nodded firmly. She was sure. Dakota gripped Sarah's shoulders and slowly, painfully, pulled herself onto the smaller girl's back. She was light, lighter than Sarah expected, but still a significant weight. Sarah wrapped her arms under Dakota's legs, careful of the injured one, and stood up. Her knees shook, and for a moment she thought she might collapse, but she steadied herself. The river lay before them, gray-brown and churning, about 50 feet of dangerous water between them and the far bank. Sarah had crossed this river 100 times, knew which rocks were stable and which were slippery, knew where the current was strongest and where the bottom dropped away into deeper pools. But she had never crossed it carrying another person, and she had never crossed it when it was running this high and fast. She took a deep breath and stepped into the water. The first step into the river sent shock waves through Sarah's body. The water was much colder than she expected. Fed by mountain streams that still carried the memory of winter snow, it swirled around her ankles with surprising force, tugging at her oversized shoes and threatening to pull them off her feet. She tightened her grip on Dakota's legs and took another careful step forward. Dakota's fingers dug into Sarah's shoulders, not painfully, but with the grip of someone who understood just how dangerous this crossing would be. Sarah could feel the native girl's rapid heartbeat against her back, could hear her breathing quick and shallow near her ear. Both of them knew that if Sarah lost her footing, they would both be swept downstream, and neither of them was strong enough to fight that current alone. The riverbed was treacherous, covered with smooth stones that shifted under Sarah's weight. Some were stable, anchored by years of water flow, but others rolled unexpectedly. Nearly sending her sprawling, she moved slowly, testing each step before committing her full weight, her toes searching through the worn leather of her shoes for solid purchase. By the time the water reached her knees, Sarah was already breathing hard. The current pushed against her legs like invisible hands trying to shove her downstream. She had to lean into it, her body at an angle, every muscle straining to keep them both upright. Her feet were going numb from the cold, making it even harder to feel what she was stepping on. Halfway across, the water rose to her waist. Sarah's dress billowed around her, the heavy fabric catching the current and adding to the force trying to sweep them away. She should have tucked it up before entering the water, but it was too late now. One hand gripping Dakota's leg. She couldn't spare the other to deal with her dress. She just had to push forward, above the rushing sound of the river. Sarah heard Dakota speaking. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. She was praying. Sarah found herself joining in silently with her own prayers, asking God to keep them safe, to guide her feet, to give her the strength to make it across. She thought of her parents, wondered if they were watching from heaven, hoped they would be proud of what she was trying to do. 3/4 of the way across, disaster struck. Sarah's right foot came down on a rock that looked solid but wasn't. It rolled beneath her weight, and suddenly she had no support for one terrible moment. They teetered on the edge of falling. Sarah threw her weight to the left, desperately trying to find balance. Her left foot found something solid, but the momentum was already carrying them over. They hit the water together. Sarah going under completely, the cold was shocking, forcing the air from her lungs in a burst of bubbles. The current immediately grabbed them. Spinning them around and pulling them downstream, Sarah's feet scraped across rocks, her knees banging painfully against the riverbed. She kicked frantically, trying to find the bottom, trying to get her head above water. Her hand brushed against something large and solid, a boulder. She grabbed it desperately, her fingers finding a crack to hold on to with all her remaining strength. She pulled herself up, dragging Dakota with her. Both girls broke the surface at the same time, gasping and coughing, water streaming from their hair and clothes. But they weren't safe yet. The current was still pulling at them. Trying to rip them away from the boulder, Sarah's grip was weakening, her fingers cramping from the cold and strain. She looked around desperately and realized that the river had actually helped them. They had been swept closer to the far bank, maybe only 15 feet away now. Dakota seemed to understand what Sarah was thinking. She tapped Sarah's shoulder and made a gesture. "Let me down?" Sarah shook her head firmly. Dakota couldn't swim or walk with that injured leg. But Dakota tapped again, more insistently, and pointed at a series of large rocks that created a path of sorts toward the shore. She was suggesting they could move from rock to rock instead of trying to wade through the deep water. It was risky, but Sarah could see it might work. She nodded and carefully maneuvered them toward the first rock. Using the boulder as a starting point, she pushed off and half swam, half dragged them through the chest-deep water. Dakota helped by paddling with her arms. Keeping their heads above water, they reached the first rock, and Sarah clung to it while catching her breath. Her arms felt like they were on fire, muscles screaming in protest. But there was no time to rest long. The cold was sapping her strength with every passing second. She pushed off toward the next rock, then the next, making slow, painful progress toward the shore. On the fourth rock, Sarah's hand slipped. She went under again, swallowing water, panic flooding through her as the current pulled at her legs. Strong hands grabbed her arm. Dakota had somehow twisted around and caught her, was pulling her back up. Their roles reversed for that crucial moment. With the injured girl saving the rescuer, Sarah broke the surface, coughing violently. Dakota's face was right next to hers, and despite the pain she must have been in, the girl was trying to smile, trying to give Sarah courage. That smile gave Sarah the boost she needed. She grabbed the rock again, steadied herself, and with renewed determination, pushed toward the next one, 2 more rocks. Each one feeling like it might be the last, Sarah's vision was starting to blur from exhaustion, and she could barely feel her arms and legs anymore. But she kept moving, kept fighting, kept refusing to give up. Dakota's presence on her back was both a burden and a motivation. She couldn't fail this girl who had put her trust in a stranger. Finally, miraculously, Sarah's foot touched bottom in shallow water. She stumbled forward, half crawling, dragging them both onto the muddy bank. They collapsed together in a tangle of limbs, both coughing and gasping, water pouring from their clothes for several minutes. Neither could do anything but lie there and breathe. Sarah had never been so tired in her entire life. Every part of her body hurt, her lungs burned, her muscles trembled uncontrollably, and she was so cold her teeth chattered violently. But they had made it, against all odds. They had crossed the river, and they were both still alive. Beside her, Dakota was crying, but these tears were different from before. They were tears of relief and gratitude. The sun beat down on the 2 girls as they lay on the muddy riverbank, still gasping for air. Sarah could feel her heart pounding so hard it seemed like it might burst through her chest. Every breath was painful, her lungs burning from the water she had swallowed and the exertion of the crossing. Beside her, Dakota was in similar condition, her injured leg now bleeding through the makeshift bandages she had wrapped around it. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah managed to sit up. The world spun around her for a moment, and she had to close her eyes until the dizziness passed. When she opened them again, she saw Dakota watching her with an expression of wonder and disbelief. It was clear the native girl couldn't understand why a settler child would risk her life for someone she didn't know. Someone from a people her own kind feared and hated. Sarah looked down at her own condition and almost laughed at how pitiful she appeared. Her dress was torn in 3 places, covered in mud and river weeds. One shoe was missing, lost somewhere in the crossing. Her arms were covered in scratches and bruises. and she could feel a nasty bump forming on her forehead where she must have hit a rock. But she was alive, and so was Dakota, and that was what mattered. Dakota reached out and touched Sarah's hand, then brought her own hand to her heart. The gesture was clear even without words. "Thank you from the depths of my soul." Sarah smiled weakly and nodded. She wanted to say something comforting, but knew the language barrier made it pointless. Instead, she just squeezed Dakota's hand gently, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The native girl tried to stand, but immediately cried out in pain and fell back down. The river crossing had made her injury worse. Her leg was now swollen so badly that the skin looked shiny and tight, and the unnatural angle of the break was even more pronounced. Sarah felt a wave of guilt wash over her. Had she made things worse by bringing Dakota across the river? Should she have left her on the other side and tried to get help instead? But there was no help to get. The settlers would never have come to aid a native girl, and Sarah had no idea where Dakota's people were. At least now they were on the correct side of the river, presumably closer to wherever Dakota needed to go. Sarah looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. The forest here was thick and dark, very different from the more open terrain on the settlement side. Dakota was speaking rapidly now, pointing deeper into the forest and making gestures that Sarah tried to interpret. It seemed like she was saying her people were somewhere in that direction, maybe a few miles away, but Sarah couldn't be sure. The girl was also pointing at the sun, which was already past its peak and heading toward the western horizon. There was urgency in her gestures, a need to move before darkness fell. Sarah knew she needed to help Dakota get to her people. But she also knew she couldn't carry the girl for miles through rough forest terrain. She was already exhausted, her muscles trembling from the river crossing, and she had no food or water with her. She needed to think of something else. Looking around, Sarah spotted a stand of young pine trees with straight trunks. An idea formed in her mind. She had seen her father make a travois once, a kind of sled that could be dragged behind a horse. Maybe she could make something similar, small enough for her to pull. It would be easier than carrying Dakota on her back. She tried to communicate her plan through gestures, and Dakota seemed to understand. The native girl nodded encouragingly and pointed to a sharp rock nearby. Sarah picked it up and realized it was actually a piece of flint with a good cutting edge. She went to the young pines and began working on cutting 2 of them down. It was hard work with such a primitive tool, but eventually she managed to hack through the trunks. Dakota watched from where she sat, occasionally calling out what sounded like instructions or encouragement. Despite the pain she must have been in, she seemed determined to help however she could. She untied the leather straps from her damaged leg splint and offered them to Sarah. She also pulled several long strips of rawhide from a pouch at her waist. Working together in their silent partnership, the 2 girls constructed a crude but functional travois. Sarah lashed the poles together with the rawhide strips, then stretched Dakota's deerskin cape between them to create a surface. It wasn't pretty, but when she tested it by putting a heavy rock on it and dragging it a few feet, it held together. The next challenge was getting Dakota onto the travois without causing her more pain. Sarah positioned it right next to where the native girl sat, then helped her scoot sideways onto the deerskin surface. Dakota bit her lip so hard it bled, trying not to cry out as her broken leg moved. But a few whimpers escaped. Sarah felt tears spring to her own eyes, hating that she was causing this brave girl more suffering. Once Dakota was settled, Sarah picked up the ends of the 2 poles and began to pull. The travois moved, sliding across the muddy ground. It was heavy, much heavier than she expected, but it was manageable. The real test would come when they entered the forest where roots and rocks would make the ground uneven. Dakota pointed the direction they needed to go, deeper into the trees where the shadows were already growing long. Sarah took a deep breath and started walking, every few steps. The travois would catch on something, a root or a rock, and she would have to back up and angle it differently. Her arms and shoulders quickly began to ache from the awkward pulling motion. They made slow progress. Sarah guessed they were covering maybe half a mile per hour. The forest was beautiful but intimidating, with massive pines that blocked out much of the sunlight and created a dim, greenish twilight even in the afternoon. Strange bird calls echoed through the trees. Unlike anything Sarah had heard near the settlement, Several times she thought she heard larger animals moving in the underbrush, and her heart would race with fear. Behind her, Dakota kept up a steady stream of talk. Sometimes it sounded like she was giving directions, other times like she was telling stories or singing soft songs. Sarah didn't understand the words, but the sound of another human voice was comforting. It made her feel less alone in this strange and potentially dangerous place. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's strength began to fail. Sarah's arms felt like they were being pulled from their sockets. Every muscle in her small body screamed for rest, but she kept dragging the travois forward, one agonizing step at a time. The forest floor was a nightmare of obstacles, fallen logs that had to be carefully navigated around, thick patches of thorny undergrowth that caught the poles and required backing up and finding a new path, and hidden holes that nearly twisted her ankle more than once. Her remaining shoe had finally given up, the sole separating completely from the upper. Sarah kicked it off in frustration and continued barefoot. Within minutes, her feet were cut and bleeding from sharp rocks and pine needles, but she barely noticed. The pain in her arms and back was so intense that it overwhelmed everything else. She had never worked this hard in her life, not even during the worst days after her parents died. Dakota had gone quiet about an hour ago, which worried Sarah. She couldn't turn around easily while pulling the travois, but every few minutes she would stop and glance back to make sure the native girl was still conscious. Each time Dakota would give her a weak smile and make a gesture to keep going. Her face had gone pale, and Sarah could see she was fighting against the pain and exhaustion. The sun was getting lower now, casting long orange rays through the gaps in the trees. Sarah knew they had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. After that, they would be trapped in this forest in complete darkness. She had no way to make fire, no food, no water, and no idea where they were going except that direction based on Dakota's pointing. Doubt began to creep into her mind. What if she had made a terrible mistake? What if they both died out here because of her foolish decision to help? Just as she was about to suggest they stop and rest, Sarah heard something that made her freeze. Voices. Human voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Dakota must have heard them too because she suddenly called out, her voice weak but urgent, shouting words that echoed through the trees. The voices stopped. There was a moment of absolute silence that felt like it lasted forever. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself or Dakota if these people were hostile. She thought about running, but she couldn't abandon Dakota now. Not after everything they had been through together. Then the forest erupted with movement. At least a dozen native men appeared from the trees as if they had materialized from the shadows themselves. They were warriors. That much was obvious from their weapons and the paint on their faces. They surrounded Sarah in seconds, their expressions a mixture of shock and anger. Several had arrows notched in their bows. All pointed directly at her. Sarah raised her hands slowly, trying to show she meant no harm. Her legs were shaking so badly she thought she might collapse. This was it, she thought. This was how her short life would end. She had heard the stories about what happened to settlers who fell into native hands. And none of those stories ended well, but then Dakota was shouting, her voice suddenly strong despite her injuries. The warriors' attention shifted to her, and Sarah saw recognition flash across their faces. Several rushed to Dakota's side, carefully lifting her from the travois while she continued talking rapidly, pointing at Sarah, gesturing at the river behind them. Clearly telling the story of what had happened, one warrior, taller than the others with gray streaking his long black hair, knelt beside Dakota and examined her leg with gentle hands. His face was stern and weathered, marked with old scars that spoke of many battles. When Dakota finished speaking, he stood and turned to look at Sarah. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. Sarah stood trembling, still holding the travois poles, unsure whether she should run or stay or speak or remain silent. The warrior walked toward her slowly, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but her exhausted legs wouldn't have carried her 10 feet before they caught her, when he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. The warrior did something completely unexpected. He placed his hand on top of her head, not roughly but firmly, and spoke a single word in his language. Then he called out to the other warriors, and they immediately lowered their weapons. Two of the younger warriors came forward and gently took the travois poles from Sarah's hands. She realized she had been gripping them so tightly that her fingers were locked in position. It took several painful seconds before she could straighten them. The warriors lifted Dakota, travois and all, and began carrying her through the forest with practiced ease. The tall warrior gestured for Sarah to follow. When she hesitated, he made the gesture again. More insistently, she had no choice, really. She was lost in this forest, miles from home, with no idea how to get back, and night was falling, so she followed, walking on her torn and bleeding feet, wondering what fate awaited her. They walked for perhaps 30 minutes. Moving much faster now that the warriors were carrying Dakota, Sarah struggled to keep up, stumbling frequently over roots she could barely see in the fading light. Once she fell completely, scraping her hands on the rough ground. One of the younger warriors came back and offered his hand to help her up. She took it hesitantly, and he pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness. Finally, they emerged from the forest into a clearing, and Sarah stopped in her tracks, staring in amazement. Before her lay a village unlike anything she had ever seen. There were at least 20 large teepees arranged in a rough circle, their buffalo hide covers painted with intricate designs that seemed to glow in the sunset light. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could smell meat roasting. The scent made her stomach clench with hunger. Women and children appeared from the teepees, drawn by the commotion of the warriors' return. When they saw Dakota being carried in injured, there were gasps and cries of alarm. An older woman, her hair streaked with gray and wearing an elaborately beaded dress, rushed forward. Her face crumpled when she saw Dakota's condition, and she began speaking rapidly, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Then the woman saw Sarah, standing small and bedraggled at the edge of the clearing, covered in mud and blood, her dress in tatters, her feet bare and torn. The woman's expression changed to confusion, then to something else as Dakota began speaking to her. Telling her story again, the woman's eyes grew wide, and she looked at Sarah with an expression of pure astonishment. More people gathered around. Everyone wanted to hear what had happened. Dakota was clearly repeating her story again and again, each time pointing at Sarah. Gesturing at her own leg, miming the river crossing, Sarah stood there feeling incredibly small and vulnerable, surrounded by dozens of people whose language she didn't speak, in a place completely foreign to everything she knew. The older woman who had rushed to Dakota's side turned out to be her mother. Sarah could tell by the way she touched her daughter's face with trembling hands, by the tears that wouldn't stop flowing, by the desperate love in her eyes. The woman called out orders, and several other women hurried forward with what looked like medicine bags and clean cloths. They carefully carried Dakota into one of the larger teepees, and the mother followed. But not before turning back to look at Sarah one more time with an expression of profound gratitude. Sarah stood in the clearing, unsure what to do with herself. The sun had fully set now, and the village was lit by fires that cast dancing shadows across everything. Children peeked at her from behind their mothers' skirts. Whispering and pointing, the warriors had gathered in a group, talking among themselves in low voices, occasionally glancing her way. The tall, gray-haired warrior who had first approached her came back carrying something. It was a fur blanket, thick and warm. He draped it around Sarah's shoulders, then gestured for her to sit by one of the fires. She obeyed gratefully, her legs finally giving out as she sank to the ground. The warmth of the fire felt like heaven after the cold river water and the evening chill. A young woman, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, appeared with a wooden bowl filled with some kind of stew. She offered it to Sarah with a shy smile. Sarah took it with both hands, mumbling, "Thank you," even though she knew the girl wouldn't understand. The stew was delicious, filled with chunks of meat and root vegetables she didn't recognize. She ate slowly at first, trying to be polite, but her hunger took over and she soon scraped the bowl clean. More food came, and water in a leather pouch. Sarah drank and ate until her stomach actually hurt from being so full after weeks of near starvation. The women of the village seemed determined to feed her, bringing dried berries, strips of smoked meat, and a kind of bread made from ground seeds. Each offering came with gentle smiles and soft words she couldn't understand, but whose kindness was unmistakable. After she finished eating, an elderly woman approached with a basket of supplies. She knelt beside Sarah and began cleaning the cuts on her feet with a solution that stung but felt medicinal. Then she applied a paste that smelled of herbs and wrapped Sarah's feet in soft leather bindings. She did the same with the scratches on Sarah's arms and the bump on her forehead, working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended many wounds. Sarah wanted to ask about Dakota to know if she would be all right, but she had no way to communicate that question. So she simply sat by the fire, wrapped in the fur blanket, and watched the village go about its evening activities. She saw men working on weapons and tools, women sewing and preparing food, children playing games that involved much laughter and running. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful. Nothing like the dangerous savages the settlers always talked about. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her. Her eyes grew heavy. And despite her unfamiliar surroundings, Sarah found herself drifting toward sleep. Someone guided her to a teepee and showed her a bed of furs piled deep and soft. She collapsed into them and was asleep before she could even think about how strange it was to be sleeping in a native village. She dreamed of the river, of being swept away by the current, of Dakota's hands gripping her shoulders, of the cold water filling her lungs. She woke several times in the night, confused about where she was. But each time, the warmth of the furs and the exhaustion pulled her back under. When Sarah finally woke for good, the sun was just beginning to rise. The village was still mostly quiet, though she could hear someone moving around outside. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body stiff and sore. Her arms felt like they had been beaten with hammers, and her back screamed in protest when she tried to stand. She pushed aside the flap of the teepee and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and fresh, and the sky was painted in shades of pink and orange. A few early risers were tending fires and preparing breakfast. They saw her and smiled, nodding in greeting. Sarah smiled back, still feeling awkward and uncertain. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold, many horses coming fast. The peaceful morning erupted into activity as warriors grabbed their weapons and women hustled children into teepees. Sarah's first thought was that soldiers from the fort were attacking, that somehow they had tracked her here and were coming to rescue her, or worse, to punish the village for taking a settler child. But the warriors weren't taking defensive positions. Instead, they were forming up in what looked like a formal reception. The gray-haired warrior from yesterday, who Sarah was beginning to realize must be someone important, stood at the front, his posture proud and commanding. A group of riders emerged from the forest trail, at least 30 mounted warriors. They were dressed in elaborate clothing, more formal than what Sarah had seen yesterday, with feathers in their hair and intricate beadwork on their clothing. They rode in formation, disciplined and impressive. At the center of the group rode a man who could only be a chief. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a face that commanded respect and eyes that missed nothing. He wore a magnificent headdress with eagle feathers that trailed down his back, and his horse was decorated with painted symbols and more beadwork. When he entered the village circle, everyone bowed their heads in respect. The chief dismounted and spoke with the gray-haired warrior. Their conversation serious and intense. Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw both men looking in her direction several times. Her heart began to race. What did this mean? Why had such an important person come to the village? Was it because of her? Dakota's mother emerged from her teepee and approached the chief. She was speaking rapidly, gesturing back toward the teepee where Dakota lay. The chief's expression changed, hardened with anger but not directed at the mother. He strode toward the teepee and disappeared inside. Several long minutes passed. Sarah stood frozen near her own teepee, afraid to move, afraid to run, afraid to do anything that might be interpreted as threatening. The village had gone completely silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. When the chief emerged from Dakota's teepee, his face was unreadable. He looked around the village until his eyes found Sarah. Then he began walking directly toward her, his warriors falling into formation behind him. It was the most terrifying sight Sarah had ever seen. 30 armed warriors, led by a powerful chief, all focused on her. Sarah's legs trembled as the chief approached, every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was surrounded by the village on all sides, and even if she made it to the forest, she would never survive alone, so she stood her ground. Trying to summon courage she didn't feel, trying to remember how her father had always told her to face difficult things with dignity. The chief stopped about 10 feet away from her, his dark eyes studying her intently, up close. Sarah could see the deep lines in his face, marks of wisdom and experience. His expression was stern, almost angry, and Sarah felt her heart sink behind him. The 30 warriors sat motionless on their horses, creating an intimidating wall of strength and power. The gray-haired warrior from yesterday stepped forward and spoke. His voice was measured and formal, clearly translating something important, though Sarah understood none of the actual words. He gestured between Sarah and the chief several times, then toward the teepee where Dakota lay recovering. The chief listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When the translation finished, the chief said something in response, his voice deep and carrying authority. Whatever he said caused a ripple of reaction through the gathered villagers, gasps and murmurs spreading like wind through grass. The gray-haired warrior looked uncomfortable, as if he wasn't sure how to proceed. Then something unexpected happened. The chief stepped forward and slowly lowered himself to one knee, putting his eyes level with Sarah's. He reached out and placed both hands on her shoulders, gently but firmly. His weathered face softened, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, meant only for her even though she couldn't understand the words. Tears suddenly appeared in the chief's eyes. This powerful man who commanded 30 warriors and led an entire people was crying as he looked at Sarah. He said something that sounded like a prayer or a blessing, then pulled her into an embrace. Sarah stood stiff with shock, not knowing how to respond, feeling the chief's shoulders shake with emotion. When he finally released her and stood back up, he called out in a voice that rang across the village. The words were clearly some kind of proclamation, formal and important as he spoke. More and more people emerged from their teepees to listen, gathering in a circle around them. When he finished, he raised one hand high in the air, and every single person in the village responded with a shout that made Sarah jump. The gray-haired warrior approached Sarah again. He spoke slowly, using simple gestures along with his words. Trying to help her understand, he pointed to Sarah, then swept his arm to encompass the entire village, then crossed his arms over his chest in what seemed to be a protective gesture. He repeated this several times until Sarah began to grasp the meaning. She was under their protection. She belonged to them now, but there was more. The chief called forward one of his warriors, a younger man who spoke broken English. The warrior stepped down from his horse and approached Sarah nervously, clearly uncomfortable with speaking the settler language. "Chief say," he began haltingly, "you save his daughter, his youngest daughter, most precious to him." The warrior paused, searching for words. "You risk life for her, you not know her. You just see person who need help?" Sarah's eyes widened. Dakota was the chief's daughter. No wonder the entire village had reacted so strongly. No wonder these 30 warriors had ridden here at dawn. The chief had probably been searching for his missing daughter all night. The warrior continued. "Chief say you have heart of warrior, heart of mother, heart of sister." He struggled with the translation. "You are now, protected. Any person hurt you, they hurt his family, they answer to him." The warrior made a slashing gesture across his throat to emphasize the seriousness of this protection. Sarah felt tears spring to her own eyes. She had expected punishment, or at best to be sent away. Instead, she was being honored, being claimed as one of their own. She looked at the chief and tried to convey her gratitude through her expression, bowing her head in respect the way she had seen the villagers do. The chief spoke again, and the warriors behind him dismounted. They began unloading supplies from their horses, bundles and baskets and leather bags. The gray-haired warrior directed them to pile everything in front of Sarah. Within minutes, there was a small mountain of goods. Dried meat and fish, tanned leather hides, woven blankets, baskets of dried berries and ground corn, clay pots and tools. The warrior with broken English explained, "Gifts for you for winter." He pointed at each item, trying to name them in English. Food, many food, blankets, warm blankets, skins for clothes, tools for work. There was enough there to keep Sarah fed and warm for an entire year. Maybe longer, but the chief wasn't finished. He called forward 2 more warriors who were leading additional horses. On these horses were more supplies, including an entire dressed deer carcass, bags of salt and other precious trade goods, and what looked like a new dress made of soft doe skin decorated with beautiful blue beadwork. Sarah recognized the beads. They were the same color as the ones on Dakota's dress. The generosity was overwhelming. Sarah had never owned so much in her entire life. Even when her parents were alive, they had struggled with just the basics. Now she was being given enough to not just survive, but to live comfortably. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know what words could possibly express her gratitude. She did the only thing she could think of. She approached the chief and took his hand, pressing it to her forehead in a gesture of deep respect. The chief smiled, truly smiled, the stern expression completely falling away to reveal warmth and kindness. He said something that made the gathered villagers laugh, but it was gentle laughter, not mocking. Dakota's mother emerged from the teepee and approached Sarah. She was carrying something wrapped in soft leather. Unwrapping it, she revealed a necklace made of small bones and blue beads arranged in an intricate pattern. She placed it around Sarah's neck, speaking softly in her language, then kissed Sarah on both cheeks. The translator warrior said, "She say you are daughter now. Her daughter, sister to Dakota." He paused, then added, "This is great honor, chief's family." "They choose you." Sarah touched the necklace with trembling fingers. Feeling the weight of what it represented, she had come to this village as a frightened orphan, alone and vulnerable. Now she was leaving as someone's daughter, someone's sister, protected by an entire people. She thought of her own parents and hoped they could somehow know that their daughter would be safe, that the compassion they had taught her had led to this unexpected blessing. The chief gave one more command, and 6 of his warriors immediately moved to gather all the gifts. They began organizing them for transport, clearly intending to escort Sarah back to her cabin. The gray-haired warrior gestured for her to wait, then disappeared into a teepee. He emerged moments later leading a gentle-looking mare. Already saddled, he handed Sarah the reins with a slight smile. Sarah stared at the horse in disbelief. She had never owned a horse, had never even ridden one. The mare was beautiful, with a coat the color of autumn chestnuts and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to study Sarah with curiosity. The gray-haired warrior helped Sarah mount, showing her how to hold the reins and where to place her feet in the stirrups. It felt strange and wonderful to sit so high up, to feel the power of the animal beneath her. The horse shifted her weight, and Sarah gripped the reins tighter, but the mare seemed to sense her nervousness and stood patiently. Before they departed, the chief made one final gesture. He removed a leather pouch from his belt and handed it to Sarah. The translator warrior explained, "Inside is medicine, for sickness, for injury. You keep always." The chief then touched his heart and pointed at Sarah, the meaning clear even without words. She would always have a place in his heart. Dakota was carried out of the teepee on a litter so she could say goodbye. Her leg was now properly splinted with wooden supports and wrapped in clean bandages. She looked much better than yesterday, color returning to her face despite the obvious pain she still felt. When she saw Sarah mounted on the horse, surrounded by gifts and protected by warriors, she smiled so brightly it seemed to light up the entire village. Dakota spoke rapidly to her father, gesturing excitedly. The chief laughed at whatever she said, then responded with what sounded like gentle teasing, making his daughter blush. The translator warrior chuckled and told Sarah, "She say you are strongest person she ever meet. She say you are her hero." He paused, grinning. "Chief say no. He say his daughter is too stubborn to die, that is why she survive." Sarah dismounted carefully and walked to Dakota's side. The 2 girls embraced, and Sarah felt Dakota press something into her hand. It was the small carved bear stone that Dakota had tried to give her by the river. Sarah had forgotten about it in all the chaos. Now Dakota was insisting she keep it. Sarah closed her fingers around it, feeling the smooth stone warm against her palm. She tucked it carefully into her pocket, a treasure she would keep forever. The journey back to Sarah's cabin took several hours, but it felt completely different from her desperate trek through the forest the day before. Now she rode the mare, which followed the lead warrior's horse without Sarah having to do much. The other 5 warriors surrounded her, 3 carrying the gifts and supplies, creating a protective circle. They moved through the forest with confidence, knowing paths that Sarah had never seen, shortcuts that avoided the densest undergrowth. When they finally emerged from the forest and Sarah could see the Snake River in the distance, with her small cabin visible on the far side, she felt a strange mix of emotions, relief at returning home, but also sadness at leaving the village. The warriors stopped at the river crossing, the same place where Sarah had first encountered Dakota. They helped unload all the supplies, stacking them carefully on the riverbank. The gray-haired warrior pointed at the supplies, then at the cabin, then made a gesture asking if Sarah could manage from here. She nodded, understanding that the warriors would not cross into settler territory. The divide between their peoples was still real, still dangerous. This small bridge of friendship didn't erase the larger conflicts and tensions. But before they left, each warrior approached Sarah individually. They touched her shoulder or head, spoke brief words in their language that she felt were blessings or good wishes. The gray-haired warrior was last. He looked at her seriously, then reached up and removed a small leather cord from around his own neck. On it hung a single eagle feather. He placed it around Sarah's neck, adding it to the necklace Dakota's mother had given her. Through gestures, he made her understand that if she was ever in danger, if she ever needed help, she should show this feather to any Shoshone she encountered. It would identify her as under the chief's protection. Sarah bowed deeply to show her gratitude and respect. The warrior smiled, really smiled, then mounted his horse. Sarah watched as the 6 warriors rode back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows between the trees as silently as they had appeared. When they were gone, she turned to look at the mountain of supplies they had left her. It would take multiple trips to get everything across the river and to the cabin, but she didn't mind. She had time. She had strength renewed by good food and rest, and most importantly, she had hope. It took her the rest of the day to ferry everything across. She led the mare through the river at the shallowest point, and the horse crossed without trouble, clearly experienced with water. Then Sarah went back and forth, carrying bundles and baskets, dragging the heavier items. Her muscles ached, but it was a good ache, the ache of productive work, not desperate survival. By the time the sun set, everything was safely stored in her cabin. The small space had never looked so full or so rich. Dried meat hung from the ceiling beams. Baskets of food lined the walls. Folded blankets and hides were stacked in one corner. The beautiful doeskin dress lay carefully across the chest that had belonged to her mother. Sarah ran her fingers over the intricate beadwork, marveling at the skill and care that had gone into making it. She prepared a proper meal for the first time in months, using the dried meat and ground corn to make a stew similar to what she had eaten in the village. As she ate, sitting by her fire, Sarah thought about everything that had happened. 2 days ago, she had been a desperate orphan, barely surviving, unsure if she would live through the winter. Now she had enough supplies to thrive, a horse to help with work and transportation, and most incredibly, a family. She touched the necklace at her throat, feeling the bones and beads, then the eagle feather. These were more than just gifts. They were symbols of connection, of belonging, of having earned a place in a community through simple human decency. Sarah had helped someone who needed help, not because she expected a reward, but because it was the right thing to do. The fact that the person was different from her, from a people she had been taught to fear, hadn't mattered when she saw another human being in pain. Over the following weeks and months, Sarah's life transformed completely. Word spread through the settlement about her connection to the Shoshone tribe. Some settlers reacted with anger and suspicion, calling her a traitor, refusing to trade with her at the post. But others were curious, even admiring. They saw that Sarah had somehow bridged a divide that had seemed impossible to cross. Dakota visited several times as her leg healed, always accompanied by her mother or other women from the village. They taught Sarah things, how to tan leather properly, how to identify medicinal plants, how to preserve food in ways the settlers didn't know. In return, Sarah taught them some English words and showed them her garden techniques. These small exchanges built understanding between two worlds that had been at war. The following spring, when tensions between settlers and tribes were escalating again, threatening to erupt into open violence, Sarah found herself in a unique position. The chief trusted her, the settlers knew her. She could speak to both sides. She became an unofficial mediator, carrying messages, translating not just words but intentions and fears, helping each side understand the other's perspective. It wasn't easy, and it didn't solve everything, but it helped. Several conflicts were resolved through talking rather than fighting. Several lives were saved because Sarah could bridge the gap with understanding and compassion. Her small cabin became a neutral meeting place, where representatives from both sides could sit and speak honestly. Sarah never forgot that it all started with one simple act. Helping a hurt girl cross a river, she had seen a person in need and responded with kindness. Not calculating the cost or potential benefit, just acting from her heart. That single moment of compassion had rippled outward, creating connections and possibilities no one could have predicted. Years later, when Sarah was grown and the territory had changed dramatically, she would tell her story to anyone who would listen. She spoke of Dakota, of the chief, of the warriors who had honored her, of how one small act of courage and kindness had transformed her life. She wore the eagle feather until the day she died, a reminder that the walls we build between ourselves and others can be crossed, that compassion transcends all boundaries, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in simply seeing another person's humanity and choosing to help.